Morning, everybody. How we doing? It's a Monday morning. We had that American phenomenon yesterday known as the Super Bowl. I'm not gonna really talk about it. I didn't really watch much of it. Turn on the last 5 minutes. Like to see the final moments, right? And Collinsworth is like, "Oh, been a penalty-free game. LA's driving. Cincinnati has a stop, 3rd and long. The linebacker makes a great play on the ball. Late flag, 1st and goal, LA. LA wins. What a garbage call. It's probably why I don't really watch the NFL anymore. It's I don't trust it. It feels intervened with too much by the refs, by Vegas, by whoever, TV gods. I'm not sure, but that was a horrible call. And cause like I don't really care. Didn't really watch the game, but watching it for 5 minutes reminded me why I didn't watch it anymore. It's artificial entertainment. It doesn't feel genuine or valid, and the commercials have become kind of more important than the game itself. But whatever. We're gonna jump into tomorrow. I think a series on the Prestige discography. Blue Note one was received pretty well, and I think Prestige will go over pretty well as well. Prestige is a mammoth undertaking. I have around 600 Prestige when you include Swingville, Moodsville, and New Jazz. And what we'll probably do is uh, I'll show you the 7,000 series, and I'll show you some of the Swingville, Moodsville from that same era, some of the New Jazz from that era. And then we'll move into the 72 and the 7300s. And we'll probably kind of break down the last later 60s section in one episode instead of trying to be too comprehensive with that later stuff. A lot of it's the same artists doing kind of soul jazz. That's great stuff, full of the blues, full of the black church, full of rhythm and blues. But I don't have it all either. There's so much of it, so much of it, such an expansive catalog. There's probably about 1,000 Prestige records, if you include New Jazz, Swingville, Moodsville, the 10-inch era, up until probably about 1970 something. And there kind of was a shift at that point, and jazz, of course, has changed dramatically by that point. And most jazz labels have a pretty finite period when they are impactful. Prestige is a very cutting edge and important label in the 50s, going into the 60s. And by the late 60s, they've kind of given way to other labels. And every decade has its own set of jazz labels that were kind of covering what was hot at that time. And the other labels have kind of turned into regurgitating the stuff from their era for their audience. It's a bit like the Super Bowl halftime show yesterday, the Snoop and Dre and all that. Those cats were for people 40, 50 and up. That wasn't current kids. And they might have known Kendrick. I haven't seen that yet either. I'm going to probably watch it some point today. Me and the wife have been watching Sons of Anarchy, a show of motorcycles, and she's a fan of the show. It's her second watch, and it's good, but it's not great. It's not like Sopranos or The Wire great. It's the writing at times is like too artificially driven into action and constant. Every episode has to have a lot of action, and real life doesn't really work quite like that. The Sopranos and The Wire, maybe to some people, are a little bit boring almost, because not every episode is going to have big shootouts and cop chases. It's going to be more real to life. And I'm more of a fan of that because those are the shows that end up kind of having more to say than just drama and action and, adrenaline. There's supposed to be a message behind art, at least good art. But so I'm going to jump into that Prestige episode starting tomorrow, I think. And I'm going to the gym, down 8 pounds now in the last 4 weeks. Feeling much better already. My energy levels are much better. My willingness to run up and down the staircase. This room has 12-foot ceilings, which means that the staircase going up to the next floor is a pretty big flight of stairs. And when I was at my heaviest, I was like, I don't think I want to make that. I'll save that trip for next time I go down there, But and then we have another floor going down to the basement where washer and dryer is, and my kids' rooms, and another TV room, and making that trip was tough last summer when it was really hot upstairs. We'd go down to the basement to watch TV. But I'm already feeling a lot better. It's so Michael Vasallo, cheers to you, mate. I'm thrilled to be getting back in shape. I'm heading to the gym here myself in an hour. Gonna play some pickup basketball. Already getting up and down the floor a whole lot better. Uh, the Blue Note thing, which we just covered, pretty extensively, around 500 Blue Notes, including the tone poets and the Japanese and all that. And I have pretty much everything from, like I said, the Alfred Frank days, minus some of the 10-inch stuff, which I haven't found yet or haven't purchased yet. And I'll say that's one of the things I do want to finish at some point is the Blue Note 10-inch series, even though a lot of it I already have on the LP 1500 series. But one of the questions that comes up, and a question that that you hear on the internet all the time, is pressings. Let's talk about pressings. What pressing is that? What pressings do you like? Which pressings do you prefer? And I don't want to offend nobody here. Which, I'm pretty capable of that. I'm pretty honest. But you know what pressing is the most important one? The one that you can afford. The one that you can find and afford. And why would you buy a $300 pressing when you can find a perfectly good copy of the same record on Discogs for $30-$40? Why buy the $300-$400 one? Honestly, if you're going to buy that collectible piece, you almost shouldn't play it. If you're going to spend that much money on a record, you're kind of entering that territory of collectible and valuable, and you want it to continue growing in value, and playing it's probably not the smartest thing. And so, buying that expensive pressing, sometimes you don't have a choice. Some records, there's only original pressings out there of a lot of these smaller labels that came out in the 50s and 60s. There's not a ton of repressings of Argos even, A lot of Argos, I have the originals because that's all there is. So I had to pay pretty good money for that Clark Terry. I had to pay pretty good money for that Paul Gonsalves. Some of those early Argo records are pretty rare. That Pinky Winters record, killer, hard to find. But the pressing that's best is the one that you can afford and find. And if it has the right cover and it's got the music, you're in. You're in like Flynn, as they said back in the day. There's no need to sit around and debating pressings endlessly. And the pressing snobbery, a lot of it's just, look at me, look what I got. Which is fine. I do that at times. Like, oh, look, I found a little copy. It's great. But that doesn't mean that if there's another copy out there for a different price that you can afford, that's not a better choice for you. Because here's part of the issue. As your collection grows, the time you're going to get to spend with each record diminishes. And to really get your value out of a $300, $400 record, you better listen to that sucker once a week for the rest of your life. Or not play it at all and sell it for $500 in 10 years. That's your two choices. Because to buy a $300, $400 record and listen to it once or twice, put it on the shelf and forget about it for 2 years, you could have bought a lot more jazz for that money. And I think that's kind of the underlying message I'm trying to get to here is the canon is such a broad empire of Mongolian expanse, Roman, occupation. The Jazz Kingdom is this huge thing. And there's no point in having 10 really expensive, good records and minimizing your knowledge and your broad interpretation of what the music is. And there's way too many collections, I think, out there that are just like one part of jazz, one era of jazz, one label on jazz. There's so much great jazz by incredible players out there on so many levels that I think if there was more peer pressure in the other direction, people would be buying such a broader range of what jazz has to offer. And Prestige is one of those red labels that has kind of achieved that next level status. Not Blue Note status yet, but Prestige and Riverside Records are certainly getting quite expensive, And Prestige, founded by Bob Weinstock, another one of those characters that wasn't one of the greatest characters in the jazz family. He's kind of a jerk, very money driven, which that makes business sense. It might not always make sense artist wise, but it makes business sense. And Prestige business model outlived Blue Notes by quite a long time. So in some ways, you can't really fault what Bob Weinstock was doing. But he is ahead of Blue Note in the early 50s without question. Uh, Blue Note dabbled with Miles very early in his career when Miles was pretty much nobody. Miles, Blue Note does those Monk recordings, 4950, and Monk was kind of nobody at that point too, and those have become treasured pieces of the Monk canon at this point. But Blue Note wasn't getting Monk when Monk was an established name by any means. Uh, there's a lot of pretty anonymous stuff on Blue Note 10-inch series, a lot of swing era stuff, Dixieland stuff. Prestige is actually more into the current era of players. The Stan Getzes, the Jerry Mulligans, uh, Sonny Stitz, the post bop, some bebop guys, Elma Hope, Frank Foster. Like they're Prestige is bringing in some pretty intense, great talent, both black and white. Their art department's very helter skelter here or there. Some covers are great. Some covers leave a lot to be desired. Uh, but there's no question in the early 50s, especially, Prestige is quite a bit ahead of Blue Note. And Riverside hasn't really come into the modern jazz picture until about 55, 56 when Riverside starts recording Monk in 56. It establishes Riverside as kind of that trio of those three great labels in New York. And really from 56 to about 62, all three of those labels are making wonderful releases after releases after releases, competing against each other. And a lot of the same artists are showing up on all three labels. A lot of the same sidemen are showing up on all three labels. They were all in New York. Of course, Savoy was part of that scene as well to a degree. Savoy in the late 40s was probably the most cutting edge label there was, along with Roost in the early 50s when Teddy Reed leaves Savoy and goes to Roost. Roost gets a lot of pretty big names that they're recording. Of course, Norman Granz at Verve, he's collecting as much talent as he can, and the Jazz at the Philharmonic has allowed him to assemble a lot of the great swing talent, and so he's going to start recording a lot of those guys. But the bebop guys, Roost and Savoy, kind of really are the ones of those big labels that we know of today that were really cutting edge and recording a lot of that stuff with Dizzy Gillespie and Bud Powell and Charlie Parker, of course. They're recording guys like Lester Young, somewhat Savoy was, Coleman Hawkins. Again, Roost brings in Sonny Stitt and does that great series of records with him. So Roost is kind of even ahead of Prestige at this point. Their run isn't as long as Prestige's, and so we've kind of lost the perspective of how great Roost was as a label. And I almost did Roost first because it wouldn't have been as big a undertaking, and I could have knocked it out pretty quickly. And I still might, because Roost, I feel like, is ahead of Blue Note and Prestige in the early 50s and the mid 50s. And then, of course, things start changing by the mid 50s. And then when hard bop kind of comes on the scene with Clifford Brown and the Miles Davis First Quintet and Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, Blue Note kind of codifies and quantizes what hard bop is. And they're leading the field when it comes to hard bop in 56, 7, 8, 9. It's a Blue Note phenomenon. Other labels are kind of playing catch up, but there's not the same degree of intensity and the degree of integrity on a lot of the Prestige sessions. The Prestige sessions aren't organized in the same way the Blue Note sessions are. The Blue Note sessions, where there was an A&R guy, Ike Quebec was the guy at this point, and he was specifically building lineups on records that he thought would be cohesive and would complement what the leader was wanting to do, the direction what the label thought was important, uncompromised, unwatered down. So each record was carefully groomed as to who the sidemen were going to be, how big a group it was going to be, what the material was going to be allowed to be, or what it wasn't going to be. You know, they gave them a lot of freedom with what they were going to play and how they were going to play it, as long as it kind of swung and I had that groove to it. Al was going to be pretty okay with it for the most part. Prestige is, again, for you guys have been around for a long time with Jazz, you guys know this. Prestige was kind of a label for heroin junkies. They would pay you off in the day of. And so if you needed to get your fix, you just show up down the Prestige Studios or head over to Hackensack or to Newark, where, no, not Newark, sorry. Wherever Prestige was recording. Sometimes it's in New Jersey, sometimes it's in New York. Van Gelder does do a lot of the Prestige stuff. But if you showed up at a Prestige recording session day, you would probably be able to get to record with someone. They would just throw you in a room, and if 3 guys showed up, they'd maybe make a trio. If 6 guys showed up, maybe they do a sextet. It wasn't very much. It wasn't no combing of, no, you're not going to really fit in with that session. We'll let these guys do it. You can, we'll get you tomorrow. Or it was pretty much who's here, let them play. And it's a lot of kind of open-ended blues, gospel, jazz on Prestige because of it. But it doesn't have the same kind of organization and intensity. And again, Blue Note's paying cats to rehearse for a couple days. So when they go in there and they cut those tracks, there's a communion among these guys because they've been sitting there together for 3 days. Not just rehearsing, but also smoking and eating, hanging out, talking about the times. And so when they played those cuts and those takes, A, they were on, and B, they were kind of in a unified place because they've been sitting there talking about what was going on, in America, in the black community, in music, in jazz, talking about rhythm and blues and country and rock and roll. These guys had a real sense of what was happening around them, and it comes across in the music. And Blue Note's very organized. It's very precise. All those records have a course, and it never feels forced. It never feels artificial, but it still feels organized and planned and neat within the lines. And with Prestige, you get a lot more, I don't want to say sloppy, but there is some of that. There is some just drugged out, drunk kind of recordings, a lot of jam sessions, a lot of just blowing sessions as they were called. It means a lot of that early 50s, mid 50s, late 50s Prestige work has a freshness to it because it's very unorganized. It's very unspecified. But it also means that you might have a record where you have a couple guys playing in a much more hard bop setting. You have a couple guys that are kind of more swing cats and a couple guys that are bebop players. And of course, they can all graph together and all it's written in the blues. And so there's not like they can't communicate, but they're not necessarily always on the same page. And if you put it in a hip hop setting, it'd be a bit like having a couple of trap kids with a couple of West Coast kids, with a couple of East Coast kids, with a couple of old school cats. And the Sugar Hill Gang is fun, but their rap style sounds funny next to Outkast Andre 3000. And you play Andre 3000, and he sounds kind of lacking in intellectuality next to Mos Def. Then you put Mos Def next to Kendrick Lamar, and their cadence sounds so different. And you have a lot of that same kind of thing in jazz at Prestige at points where some of these records, they lack cohesion. They lack a unified kind of feel, direction, setting. Again, some of that can be a benefit. Some of that can be a very immediate, honest expression of how I feel today. And there's times those records move the shit out of me because I'm like, oh man, this dude sounds like he's having a rough week. But the next guy might come on and sound like he's having a joyful week because he just got nut that morning, So there's very seldom on a Blue Note record from player to player do the solos not feel like they're kind of commenting and communicating with each other. Take Grant Green, Island Moments. All those solos on that record, Henderson Green on that track, Henderson Green, Duke Pearson, Bobby Hutcherson, all 4 of those solos really feel like they're commenting and responding to what the guy before them or after them is saying or talking about. There's a unity, cohesion. And like I said, a lot of the Prestige stuff doesn't quite have that. It's still become very collectible. And if you have that wonderful yellow firework Prestige logo, that's a pretty fun collectible thing to find. This is the Kai and JJ record. A lot of early Prestige 7000 stuff is vault stuff. It's stuff from the 10-inch era, sometimes even the 78 era. And Prestige, unlike Blue Note, who in the first 15, 18 records, puts a lot of that stuff out, and then they don't really go back to it a ton after. There's a few things they come at, like the Fast Navarro. So there's a few pieces that Blue Note continues to issue into the 1500 series. But by the mid 1500 series, there's no more antiquated material. It's all pretty much new, fresh, cutting edge material consistently. And Prestige never really stops going back to the vaults from the 10-inch era, the 78 era, and repackaging that stuff onto the LP. So a lot of stuff in the early 7000 series, especially, this is 7030, a lot of the stuff will be from earlier date, especially early on, but they continue doing that well into the 73, 7400s. There's still, this is early tracks of Stan Getz from like 52, and we're in 1966 by now. But Stan Getz is popular right now. He's killing it over on Verve. We better put some Stan Getz stuff out that we got. And again, that's something that Prestige does nonstop, especially with guys like Monk and Miles and Coltrane, Rollins, Getz, the big names that Prestige has over the years that all move on to bigger things and better paychecks. Prestige keeps cashing in on those guys constantly, and I've told you guys that many times. But when I do that series, you'll really see that driven home, just how in the Blue Note 4000 sequence, 4100 sequence, there's not a title in there that's not new material. It's all new material. No collections, no greatest hits. Every number in that sequence is a value. And some of these Prestige 100 record sequences, 7100, 7300, there's probably 15, 20 titles in a lot of those series that aren't necessary. They're a compilation, they're greatest hits, they're repackaged. It's just a different cover, different number, So it just diminishes the value of the overall sequence of Prestige records. And some of those Rollins and Monk records, those later versions of those records, are cheaper and easier to find, so it gets you access to that music for a better price. But again, it's also kind of a compromise, and it's also kind of an illustration of how money governed what Prestige was about a lot of the time. But again, Prestige lasted a lot longer than Blue Note, and so on some levels, you can't fault Prestige, and you can kind of point a finger at Blue Note saying, hey, if you guys have been a little bit more about the money, you might have made it a little longer in this business. But I think Frank and Al were tired. They've been doing it since the late 30s. The music had changed leaps and bounds over that time. And I think by the time 67, 68 was rolling around, it's hard as you get older to keep relating to younger kids. And even myself as a DJ now, as I approach 50, I can still play music by younger kids, but I don't always relate to it. I don't always even feel comfortable playing it sometimes. I've played plenty of stuff from the last 5 years that I'm not a Cardi B fan. I'm not a Nicki Minaj fan. I'm not really a Migos fan. I'm not really Pop Smoke. I kind of like that record, but I don't really relate to it. You know what I mean? I don't want to sit around talking about fashion designers I can't stand all the fashion designer talk. It's so stupid. But and so that's kind of what you're getting with jazz too. I think Al and Frank were definitely exhausted by that time, and almost ready to be like, okay, I'm done with it. And Prestige kind of, once they move into the soul jazz thing, they kind of stay there. They phase out the new jazz sequence. They stop being experimental. They kind of stay with what's selling. And the Prestige soul jazz stuff of the 60s into the 70s did have 45s. They did make it into jukeboxes. They had minor R&B hits at times that were kind of keeping Prestige fluid with cash. It sold in black neighborhoods. Black bars had a lot of Prestige 45s in their jukeboxes. And that's true for Blue Note as well in the late 60s. A lot of those Horace Silver type tracks made it out of 45, and Three Sounds were in the 45. They were in jukeboxes. It's fun finding old jazz 45s. There's quite a lot of them out there, and they're not that expensive either, which is kind of cool. But so Prestige is a different beast, and they certainly have attained a high level of respect, in part because of the artists that they brought in over the years and took a chance on. Miles, Monk, Coltrane, Rollins, those four, I think, are the real preeminent names that are on the tip of every even young collector's tongue. You know those names. And so you're going to be drawn towards the Prestige catalog and, what Miles did there, what Coltrane does there, what Rollins and Monk are doing there. And I don't think any of those guys made their best recordings at Prestige. And there's probably not a ton of artists that you would even say their best work was at Prestige. I do love Cooking, Working, Steaming, and Relaxing, but that's kind of just an exercise in a great tight band that's played together in the bar for a year, just knocking out 4 records in 2 days. It's not saying a lot about Prestige per se. And a lot of Miles' earlier work on Prestige, it's marginal in terms of how important some of his later records have become. A lot of that early Prestige stuff's not going to be familiar to everyone for Miles Davis. Monk's Prestige recordings are pretty good. I really like those a lot. They're on par with the Blue Note stuff, if not even a little better. Although Monk really hits a stride when he goes to Riverside, like I said, in 56. Rollins does some of his best work at Prestige, truly. Saxophone Colossus is a monster. +4 with Clifford Brown's group. That's a fantastic record. Rollins does some pretty good work. Rollins is in that period, though, where he's doing great work at Riverside and Blue Note as well. And it's Rollins that's kind of in that peak and hungry part of his career. Prestige just kind of happened to be there, it feels like. Stan Getz does some good work there. Sonny Stitt does. Sonny Stitt kind of has early and late stuff there. It kind of bookends his career at Prestige. Coltrane, of course, his first solo work is at Prestige. And it's kind of his Sheets of Sound era, 58, 59. He's been kind of developing, playing with Miles, 55, 56, 57. Miles had moved to Columbia. Prestige had signed Coltrane. And Coltrane's developing kind of continuously in his career. He never really stays static. And so you have one era of Coltrane on Prestige fairly well documented from, like I said, 57 to 59 or so. Then he moves over to Atlantic. But none of that Prestige Coltrane really matches Blue Note, or probably even his Atlantic stuff. A lot of it's called together from different sessions. At Coltrane, there's probably twice as much Coltrane issued under his name after he leaves the label as there is while he's there recording for Prestige. I think there's 4, maybe 5 actual Coltrane albums that were designed to be albums. And there's a ton of stuff that comes out from the vaults of sessions that he was a part of that were under somebody else's name. They get repackaged under Coltrane's name. There's a lot of that. A lot of that, the Car and Black Pearls and the First Train. A lot of that stuff's repackaged stuff, unreleased stuff, stuff that was originally recorded under so-and-so, So again, Prestige does do a lot of noteworthy stuff, but it doesn't always feel like it's under the tutelage or the design of Prestige. It just happens to be you caught that guy at a good point in his career. They do some great work with Elmo Hope in this early era and fit in the 7000 series that I'm a big fan of. There's some great records in there without question. And what I like about Weinstock is he gives a lot of black guys a chance. He's not as black centric as Blue Note was, but he certainly gives a lot of black guys a chance and gives them an honest, open setting. He's not meddling and interfering with anything, almost to a point of detriment. There's so little oversight. And guys were obviously stoned a lot. Not I mean stoned, I mean stoned. They were high, they were hungover, they were strung out. You can play when you're strung out. You can play when you're high. Not all cats can do it. Not everyone's a great player when they're strung out. But it's still noteworthy stuff. And I think you'll enjoy this series. There'll be some titles in here, unlike Blue Note. There's numerous titles here in the 7000, 7100 sequence that you probably have never seen. And with Blue Note, everything's been repackaged and reissued in the Tone Poets and all the different various books on their album covers and all the Facebook groups. Everyone's posting Blue Note, Blue Note, Blue Note, Blue Note. So posting a Blue Note that people haven't seen is pretty difficult. It's not really something you can do. I've posted a few Stanley Turrentine records from the mid-60s that didn't sell very well or just haven't really made the circles. And I've had people like, oh, I've not seen that one. Turrentine has some stuff that wasn't issued as well that came out later. But there's stuff in the early 7000s sequence that you'd be like, Sanford Gold, what's that? You know, Hope Meets Foster, what's that? You know, there's some pretty obscure Barbara Lee. There's some obscure stuff. I like a lot of that obscure stuff. I think it's really great. But again, it also shows you if the Blue Note sound was this, and it was clearly being a defined Blue Note sound, especially once you get to the mid 50s, into the 60s with the Boogaloo and the multiple branches in the 60s with the kind of the new thing and then the Boogaloo, and they were kind of doing two things simultaneously, but they both had a Blue Note thing to them. You know, the Blue Note Boogaloo is Blue Note Boogaloo, and the avant-garde is more connected to a larger scene, but even the Blue Note avant-garde stuff has kind of a Blue Note-esque tinge to it, an element of we're going to keep some pocket in it. But with Prestige, from title to title, year to year, there's very little sense of a unified direction. There's not like a string of like 10 releases in a row that are just this pinnacle of Blue Note hard bop like you have in the like 1500 series with Blue Note. From like 1576 to 1586, like every one of those records is just like, wow, that's incredible. You're not going to get that at Prestige. You're not going to get this string of just incredible things. You'll have a Coltrane record, followed by some obscure thing, followed by a repackaging of a Rollins, then you'll have some Barbara Lee, then you'll have some weird organ. Like it's very unorganized. There's no direction, which also means you don't really necessarily always know what you're going to get when you buy a Prestige record. It can be a real shooting from the hip. So I'm looking forward to diving into this with you guys. I think the New Jazz sequence is probably the most focused sequence at Prestige. But even there, you're like, why is it's not? There's not like clarity to it. Why something's here and something's there. And a lot of artists will get records on both sides of that. We'll put this one on 7000. We'll put this one on New Jazz. So there's not a lot of clarity to it whatsoever. But there's certainly more of a modern cutting edge to what's on New Jazz for the most part. So again, Dolphy is another great name that Prestige is associated with. But almost all that Dolphy stuff is live stuff. And a lot of it comes out after he passes. And so it's hard to praise Prestige as much as I think people tend to do. The deeper you dig into it, the more you're like, they're kind of a victim of circumstance. And a lot of it worked out in their favor posthumously. It's really shone a lot of light on what they did. But I think a lot of it's kind of just, this is how the cards played out for them. And again, if you look at Riverside with Bill Grauer and Orrin Keepnews, again, they weren't great at the money side of things. They were great at the art and understanding what was great jazz. But Keepnews was engineering and producing records and finding talent. And Grauer was supposed to be running the business side of things, and he ran it into the ground. And when Grauer up and died in 62, I think it was, it kind of buried Riverside, and they ceased to be pretty quickly, which is a great loss for jazz. Riverside was a great label. And Savoy by 61, 62 have really deviated into gospel and rhythm and blues, and they've really gone away from jazz. They're dabbling here and there still, but it's really, it's really cool once you know the history of all these labels. It's really cool when you can see how, oh man, Savoy in late 40s was it, and then early 50s it was Roos, and then Prestige is great in early 50s, mid 50s, and then mid 50s, late 50s is Blue Note, and then late 50s, early 60s is Riverside, Blue Note, and Prestige. And Atlantic's splicing pieces in there all along that's fantastic. There's a lot of great stuff coming on. You have all the white labels that are also doing great records, from Bethlehem to Storyville to Pacific and Contemporary and Fantasy, the Chicago labels. When you see all that stuff lined up and you can look at year by year what each label's doing and seeing where the innovations are, it's a pretty interesting angle to see all this unfolding from. And it makes a lot of what even the modern critics today and jazz writers have to say. Some of them are fools. Some of them I don't think have nearly enough knowledge about the classical era of jazz to be speaking about it. And just having read a few things just means you're repeating something that you've read. You don't know if what that guy wrote was even right at the time. And there's a lot of times I'm reading stuff, reviews, and guys trying to comment on something. It's like, man, you don't even know what you're talking about. You have no idea what you're talking about. Argo was doing killer shit in '56. What do you know what I mean? What are you talking about? And so you got to be careful with a lot of the jazz writers, especially today. And I was just reading this little article I think Ken shared on his Facebook group about how substance is kind of been put aside, and talking about music even isn't what's important. A lot of writers stay in the music field are talking about lifestyle and fashion and what they're eating and where they went to vacation, who they're married to, and who they're cheating on. It's music is taking such a backseat, and this channel here is always going to be focused on the music, and we're going to talk about what the music was saying and what it was about and what it's connected to and the tissue that builds what the skeleton is. And so I'm going to wrap that up and leave it there for today. But we'll probably delve into the first part of the Prestige tomorrow. I got to pull some stuff out and probably put a few things back in sequence. I think some Sonny Stitt stuff was still pulled out. So I got to organize that. I can do that when I get home tonight from the gym. Y'all be safe. Appreciate you all. I hope you have a great Monday, and we'll talk to you soon. Peace.